Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 107 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. I'm down here in the bunker. My name is Dr. Jeff Winkle, and I'm here, as always, with my friend and co-host, Dr. David Noe. How you feeling tonight, Dave?
I'm doing pretty well. Just friend, not some, kind adjective. Good friend, special friend.
You're going to have to just settle for friend tonight.
All right, I'm settling. I'm settling. I'm doing pretty well. We got ourselves out of that terrible polar vortex now.
That's right, which impeded us. I think we were 0 for 2 trying to get down here.
That's correct.
To do this episode, but we're back, yeah.
Terribly impeded. So there's been a lot of different names given to this snowstorm that has swamped the Midwest.
Yes.
Snowpocalypse.
Snowmageddon. It was, I think the meteorological term was, it was a bomb cyclone.
Bomb cyclone.
Yeah.
Like a shark tornado? Tornado full of sharks?
Yeah, Sharknado.
Correct.
Yeah.
How about some classically themed ones?
You got some?
Scylla and Snowribdus.
Nice. I like that.
That's not too bad.
No, I was caught between both of those.
That's correct.
Yes.
Between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And what are the rocks that crash together and smash?
The Symplegades?
Yes, yeah. The Symplegades, the Snowplegades. Could that
I like
smashed between those?
I like it. Our local weather teams could have used a lot of these.
They could. They were pretty dry. We're running out of steam here already, aren't we? Some kind of a chimera, right? Like a snowmera.
A snowmera?
Mm-hmm.
I like it. Yeah.
What's that creature that has kind of a horse body but bird features?
Talking about a griffin? A hippogriff.
A hipposniff. Put a little snow in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
My car outside on the curb today.
Correct.
I spent a good hour digging that thing out. It had been buried by the plow. Look, it had been swallowed by a sniffogriff.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm feeling well.
Good.
I'm feeling a little bit astute, I hope, and maybe hirsute.
Yeah, definitely hirsute from my vantage point over here.
Yeah, what do you mean?
I mean, the beard.
I was just fishing for a compliment there.
It looks very 19th century.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Like I could be some kind of a German Protestant theologian or something who walks 3 miles to school to teach a little bit of Latin and then walks home and...
Right, exactly. Or I would say like maybe President Benjamin Harrison.
Really?
Yeah, just kind of gets it.
Not pork choppy yet.
No, but it's getting there.
Well, it began with No Shave November.
Okay, then.
It just transitioned into December. And now we're moving into January.
So it's going to keep on growing.
Well, we have February and March stash.
So there's no end in sight.
Well,
really.
I can't think of anything to do with April.
But we got at least 3-4 months of
correct
of hirsuteness.
I hope so. But this podcast is not about facial hair.
No, it's not.
Appearances to the contrary.
No, what are we talking about tonight?
Well, we're going to take Occam's razor.
Yes.
Okay. Like that?
That's right. Yeah, that's the hair theme again.
That's right. We're going to take Occam's razor to the Lucan Census of Quirinius. Luke chapter 2, the evangelist talks about at the birth of Christ, there was a census taken by Quirinius, the governor of Syria, during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And this is a troubling passage in some ways.
Okay.
So we're going to wade through a number of journal articles. We're going to do a little bit of historical research, a little bit of archaeology, literary archaeology, and see if we can find some resolution to these troubling issues.
All right. So we're gonna save the issues for now.
Oh yes,
okay.
We've got a shout out.
Oh, we do.
Yes.
We do.
Did you read the script, Winkle?
I'm looking at it right now. We have a shout out going out to one Nathan Molker.
That's correct.
All right, and he writes, "Hi, I love the podcast and figured I'd take up the repeated request for people to write in for shout outs. Thank you."
Yes, finally.
Yes.
Thanks, Nathan.
I love the podcast fresh take on classical themes. I was homeschooled and took several years of Latin. I couldn't say I ever made it to erudite, however, and I have much to look forward to in terms of seeking to improve my Latin. He says, I am an attorney on the staff of the Chief Justice of Alabama. Wow.
That's pretty impressive.
Okay, he's moving in the corridors of power.
That's correct.
Yeah. Nice. He says,
sharpening pencils, mimeographing things. Do people mimeograph these days?
I don't know. I remember the big crank. And
That's correct.
That
terrible
smell.
inky smell.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You felt like Gutenberg when you went up to one of those things.
It wasn't that far distant from the Gutenberg technology.
It's completely sanitized.
It
just
is.
a flash across your retina and 50 copies.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Nathan.
Yes, he continues. He says, our profession uses Latin constantly, although most lawyers do not really understand it.
I like the exclamation point that he put after that.
Yeah.
A little bit of frustration there.
Yeah. He says perhaps an episode on legal Latin could be interesting. It's not a bad idea
That's
at
an
all.
excellent suggestion. I've been thinking about this, though, and it may give us some difficulty because there's quite a gap between what you might take as the natural translation of the terms.
Yeah.
Certiorari is one really
right.
mouth-breaking, jaw-busting phrase, between what you might take as the natural translation of the phrase and what it has come to mean in the legal parlance.
Yeah. I like this idea.
You do?
I think that'd be interesting.
We should pursue it. Maybe even get a lawyer or two on here and see what they think about it.
Nice. And he ends with some Latin here.
Nice.
Quid Latine dictum sit altum videtur.
All right, which we've used before on a particular episode.
We have. Yep. So whatever is said in Latin just seems loftier.
That's correct.
Seems lofty. Yeah.
Sounds deep.
Not so long ago, I was walking through the student lounge at my school, and there was a young lady there with a shirt that had this very phrase on it. And I went up to her because
Being a classicist.
Exactly. And I said, "Hey, I love your shirt. Hey, where'd you get it?" And she goes, "Really?" She says, "I have no idea what it means." Says, my mom gave this to me, but I have no idea what it says.
That's funny. It says, "Don't wear articles of clothing with sayings you don't understand."
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of reminded me of there's kind of a phase right now where students are wearing T-shirts of bands that they've never listened to.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so, I see kids with a Nirvana shirt on,
right? And
it has a certain cachet,
right?
But they couldn't tell you anything about the band or the music
because these kids were born nearly a decade
after
the decease, right. Of Kurt Cobain,
right? But they have kind of the logo and the name has a kind of pop culture cachet that's completely divorced from the art itself,
much like Latin.
But wow, way to bring that back around.
Thanks.
Right. All right, so let's get into this.
Okay.
All right, so you said there are some issues here with the Lucan Census of Quirinius. And
that's correct.
This, famous passage, one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture, Luke chapter 2.
Correct.
Right.
So we're going to start out by reading the Greek of the first 4 verses of Luke chapter 2, then go on to a translation and lay out the problem that we have here.
All right, you want to tackle that Greek for us, Dave?
Yes, I'd love to do that. So this is koine Greek. Here we go. Agenata de entais hemerais ekenais exelthen dogma para Kaisaros Augustu apographestai passante oikumenen. Haute apographe proteagenata hege maneuantos tes Syrias kure niu. Kai eporevanta pantes apographestai. Hekastas esten hiau tu pollen. Anebe decai Yosef apartes Galileas, ec poleos Nazaret, esten Judaion, es pollen David, hetis kaletai Bethlehem. Diata enai autan ex oiku kai patrias David, apograpsastai sun Mariam te emnestelmene auto use enkuo.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
We've done so much Latin lately.
Yes, correct.
It's nice to hear some Greek on the pod.
Yeah, I was very much drawn to this topic for that reason.
Yeah. And the translation of this is from the New International Version. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David.
And also I read verse 5.
Oh, you did?
Sorry. I didn't say that.
It goes on, he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child.
That's correct.
All right.
Use enkuo, right?
Yeah.
While she was pregnant. So it's a beautiful, good way to begin this particular part of Christ's nativity story. Mm-hmm. But for a very long time now, more than a century, scholars have had a great deal of trouble figuring out some of the facts of the census that's mentioned in verse 1. Right, the word here for census or decree is dogma, right? A dogma, exealthen, went out from Caesar Augustus to enroll the entire world, passantein oikumene. Mm-hmm. So we've got 4 separate issues here, which arise from the passage, and they have thus far proved largely insoluble to scholars of this particular text.
Okay, now that's you said a lot there, and that needs a lot of unpacking.
Correct.
So what exactly are the issues?
Right.
What's the problem here?
Right. So I'm going to rely here on the Expositor's Greek Testament. So this is quite an old work, 1897. It's not current scholarship. We're going to look at some more current scholarship in this episode, but I think this nicely lays out the issue. And this is published by W. Robertson Nicoll. He's the editor. And of this particular volume, the scholar is a man named Alexander Balmain Bruce.
Okay.
He covers the Synoptic Gospels. So this would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so originally written in 1897, this is from a reprint. First problem number one. Apart from the gospel, history knows nothing of a general imperial census in the time of Augustus.
Okay.
So that's the first issue. Second issue, there could have been no Roman census in Palestine during the time of Herod the Great, a Rex Socius, that is an allied king, right?
Okay.
So the idea here being Luke is wrong, on two counts. It is only Luke who mentions a general imperial census in the time of Augustus. So if it's only mentioned by one individual, that brings a lot of, implausibility to its reliability. It can't be really reliable if Luke is the only person who mentions
Gotcha, yes.
the general imperial census. Now, we're going to unpack each of these claims, relying on a number of different articles,
Okay.
and take a look at each of them. The second one, there could have been no Roman census in Palestine during the time of Herod the Great because he was a Rex Socius. He was an allied king. So
a Roman census wouldn't have covered that territory?
Correct.
Okay, all right.
So he was under Roman authority since the time that Pompey the Great, the rival of Julius Caesar, took over Judea in the 60s BC. But as an allied king, not a subject, he had a certain level of independence.
Gotcha.
Yes, he was a puppet king, but they wouldn't have taken a Roman census in his territory. That's the claim.
Okay.
That's
all
the
right.
claim.
Okay.
Third claim, and this is probably the most difficult one, the third one. Such a census at such a time could not have been carried out by Quirinius, for he was not a governor in Syria then, nor till 10 years later, when he did make a census which gave rise to a revolt under Judas of Galilee.
Okay. And that is something that is historically secure.
That's correct. Okay. So here is the problem with the chronology. Every source that we have, every secular source, every non-Lucan source, says that Quirinius was not the governor until 6 or 7 A.D.
Okay.
And the birth of Christ, according to the Gospel of Matthew, took place during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 B.C.
Okay.
So if that's when Christ was born, prior to 4 B.C., maybe 5 or 6, from everything we know, Quirinius was not the governor then.
Okay.
Therefore, the census could not have taken place under him, and Luke turns out to be grossly inaccurate in his claim of the census.
Okay.
That's the third problem. The fourth problem, under a Roman census, it would not have been necessary for Joseph to go to Bethlehem or for Mary to accompany him.
Okay. And we know this from details of other Roman census that...
Well, that's the claim, but as we dig down into this a little deeper, we're going to find that each of these claims doesn't really stand up to the most careful scrutiny. There are still some problems with the third one about Quirinius. I don't think they are insoluble problems.
Okay.
But, the other three, they don't really stand up to careful scrutiny.
Okay. So how are we going to go about this, Dave?
Well, I think we should start by talking about Luke as a historian generally and laying out a few of the issues there. Then look at the person of Quirinius from the other sources that we have, Josephus and Tacitus in particular. And then we'll make our way through the different articles that we've been doing our research on to kind of lay out the problem and see if we can respond to these 4 issues that have been raised.
Sounds great. Okay, so let's take a look at Luke as a historian.
Right. So in Luke's preface to his gospel, it's often been observed that he is quite Thucydidean in nature. So he's not a mere storyteller. He makes some pretty bold claims about the reliability of what he's saying. He's acting like a historian more than, a simple storyteller. At least that's how he sees himself.
Okay.
So in Luke chapter 1, translating here from the ESV, he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses," that's autoptai, "and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." So orderly account, it says he followed them closely, akribos, or precisely, to give you an orderly account, Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught.
Okay, all right. So he's taking things these sources that he's referring to, or these the word that has been delivered to this. Is this that mysterious kind of quasi document Q that you often hear about?
Well, that's one theory.
Okay.
That's one hypothesis, and I'm making my way through some a particular argument on this right now. I don't remember the name of the book actually, but it's examining the relationship between the three synoptic gospels.
Yeah.
And as you know, the two most important literary, problems you might say in all of Western lit is first, who is Homer, right? How did those two epics get written? And secondly, what's the relationship between the different synoptists?
Yes. Yeah.
And so one theory is that, yes, there was a Q document from which both Matthew and Luke drew, and then they may have compared it partly with Mark. There are many other theories as to who are Luke's sources. But the point really from this that I'm looking at is how Luke takes himself to be really precise as an historian. And that's going to prove important later when we look at the evidence for the census.
Okay. Now, this figure of Theophilus that Luke mentions here, that he's addressing here, who he's writing this account for, I believe it's Dr. Paul Meyer,
correct,
from Western Michigan, just down the road from us.
Yes, down in Kalamazoo,
right? Who's written a lot of stuff about kind of the first century, right? And,
that's right,
and
both popular and scholarly works.
Yes, right. So his claim is that this Theophilus is a kind of code name,
correct,
right, for one Titus Flavius Sabinus.
Yes, or at least it's I don't know if he's so much claiming it as he's just kind of speculating that this is the individual that fits the mysterious God lover who's mentioned in Luke chapter 1. Right?
Okay.
Because the name Theophilus means, you who are a respecter of the divine.
Right.
Without any real identification. And notice he's given also this adjective kratista, this vocative, this superlative, most powerful, which is translated, most excellent. But it's a title that you don't use for, just any individual. It's not like saying "sir." It's an elevated title.
Yeah. Now, is Meyer making the claim that that Luke is using Theophilus for this guy to protect him?
Perhaps.
Okay.
And there's an old tradition that Titus Flavius Sabinus, right, who was the elder son of Titus Flavius Sabinus and the brother of the Emperor Vespasian, that he was married to a woman who converted to Christianity. One of the few high society Roman women, aristocrats, who converted to Christianity. And so the story is that Luke wrote his gospel addressed to this person, right, the husband of the woman he knew was a Christian, in part to win favor for the Christian cause with someone who's in a very high place, right, right next to the emperor.
I see.
Although maybe not at that time, because Vespasian was not the emperor until 69, and the Gospel of Luke may have been written quite a bit earlier.
Yeah.
Still, Titus Flavius Sabinus was a well-known Roman politician at the time.
Right. Now, it raises questions in my mind, maybe in the audience too, is that, okay, he's writing this account for Theophilus.
Right.
That Luke's intention, was his intention for this gospel to be copied and read and circulated, or was his intention was just to simply convince or provide it for this Theophilus? And the fact that it becomes one of the four canonical gospels is almost like an accident of history.
Right. I think it's false dichotomy.
Okay.
I think he intends it primarily for Titus Flavius, for Theophilus, whoever that is, if it's Titus Flavius Sabinus. But he intends it also to be read by Christians around the Mediterranean and the many Greek cities to which it was sent.
Okay.
In the same way that, when you write a poem or something like that, you may dedicate it to some noble, but you intend it for public consumption.
Okay. All right.
A very, very standard trope, right, in Greco-Roman literature.
Yes.
So the idea, though, is that Luke, as an historian, is actually quite reliable because his claims are falsifiable.
Okay.
Specifically here in Luke chapter 2, and this is going to be important. Why would he go out of his way to date and locate the birth of Christ? Why would he say it happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, that a dogma went out, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus to enroll the whole world? Why would he bother with all of that, specifically since it's so easily proven false if he's just making it up?
Right.
He loses all credibility immediately.
Right, exactly. And these are details that are not mentioned in the other three gospels at all, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. The Gospels of Mark and John contain no infancy narrative whatsoever, and the Gospel of Matthew is told largely from Joseph's perspective, the early chapters, and there's no mention of a census, and there's a lot of quotation of Old Testament prophecy, and there's none here in Luke's account. So at least in this particular part. In other words, as many scholars have observed, there's no reason for Luke to create a story to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, because he's not using that as proof of the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Gotcha. That makes
Whereas
sense.
Matthew gets them into Bethlehem, specifically in part to show that it's a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, but Matthew does not mention the census.
Right. Matthew begins with the genealogy to,
Right.
to trace Christ's connection to the house of David.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, one of the first articles that's going to help us navigate this issue is by Mark Smith.
Yes.
Right. And you're going to read a little bit of that for us.
Yeah. So this comes from an article entitled Of Jesus in Quirinius from the Catholic Biblical Quarterly back from April 2000, in which Smith writes, "The evidence provided by Luke is quite strong by historical standards because it is falsifiable. If Luke talked to any Palestinian Jews in preparation for his writing, or if he consulted any traditions passed down by them, as he implies in his prologue, it is most probable that he would have been advised of his chronological blunder. In addition, had he included such a chronological non sequitur, his narrative would have lost the Thucydidean scrupulous tone which he sets up so carefully in the prologue. Instead, before completing his second chapter, he would have revealed that he was not a careful researcher at all, and his audience would have little reason to take seriously the historical references in the remainder of his narrative. The fact that Luke's account of Quirinius and his census is falsifiable as historical evidence and is so easy for him to verify and correct makes it most improbable that he made the error of which he is often accused."
Right.
Okay.
So what do you think of that argument?
I think it makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
My sense, growing up and from what I've learned is that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and in the Book of Acts, that he's a very good historian. Mm-hmm. That there are many things in both of those books that have been corroborated by archaeological and other literary evidence.
Right.
And so it would just seem on the from that this would be a very odd error for him to make.
Right. Well, later on the next page, actually, Smith supports the contention that you expressed just there about how careful Luke is as an historian. So answering the question, did Luke just make up the census of Quirinius as an excuse to get them to Bethlehem? Smith says, this is page 284, he says, he could have sent the family to Bethlehem for any reason, or he could have begun his narrative in Bethlehem as had Matthew, and he would not have damaged his theological point at all. So the theological point in question is, some people say that Luke was concerned to show that Jesus was not a revolutionary. He was not intending to overthrow the Roman government. And there are many instances in the Gospel of Luke where Christ is shown to be a law-abiding subject of the Roman Empire. Now, if you take it that it's an accurate account, well, then Luke does so because that's how Jesus actually behaved. But if you think that, he's crafting a story to give an impression that may be false, well, then you would say he did all of that to create the impression, and he added in the census of Quirinius to show that, see, even Jesus' extended family were good Roman subjects. So Smith goes on and he says, why would he make up a story with confused chronology, one which could easily be checked and falsified by his audience, when it offers him little advantage? In addition, Luke appears to have been remarkably well informed about the geographical distribution and governmental structures and officials of the Roman provinces. Now, this is really interesting, Jeff. I didn't know this before. It's because I haven't been reading closely, I guess. For example, despite the rapid changes that took place in the government of Cyprus, Luke correctly identifies Sergius Paulus as proconsul. This is in Acts. He rightly notes that Philippi was a Roman colony governed by strategoi, the appropriate Greek equivalent of duoviri juridicundos. Epigraphic evidence has verified Luke's use of the unusual term politarchs to describe the leaders of Thessalonica. The ruler of Malta is correctly styled protetes meridos. Both asiarchs and a proconsul appear in Luke's narrative of Paul in Ephesus, and these are all titles that are confirmed in Roman sources.
So Luke knows his stuff.
He does.
Yeah,
he is extraordinarily careful about chronology and terminology where he wouldn't necessarily have to be.
Right.
And in fact, Smith says on the next page, the point is that Luke could have used a general term like leaders in each of those cases when he's documenting Sergius Paulus on Cyprus and, who's in charge of the island of Malta, and saved himself considerable effort. He did his homework, says Smith, and most importantly, in the cases where we can test him, he consistently got the details of chronology and terminology correct.
Yeah.
So this raises the obvious question. Why would he make it up in the case of Quirinius when it's like it's a large world event, he claims,
Right.
so easily falsifiable?
Right. So, yeah, exactly. And especially a piece of chronology, a very important piece of chronology,
Right.
which is, about kind of the main character in the gospel.
Yes.
Right? This isn't just kind of a throwaway reference to a ruler on Malta.
Right.
As impressive as it is that he gets that right, it would be kind of extraordinarily sloppy for him to get that detail wrong.
Exactly so. So Smith sums it up this way. He says, the second view, that is that Luke made it up, though not impossible, is not much more probable than the first theory, that he's just mistaken. As historians view probability, both of the common explanations of Luke's reference to Quirinius are less than convincing. Is there no other alternative? Smith asks. So all of this is occasioned, you understand, by the apparent conflict between what happens in Matthew, that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great,
Yes.
and when Luke says that the census took place while Quirinius was governor. There's a deep chronological conflict, apparently.
Right. So, but just to reiterate,
Right.
it's more or less kind of a 10-year gap, right?
That's right.
So Herod the Great dies in 4 BC.
Yep.
And then Quirinius, we know that he was governor of Syria in 680.
Yes.
Okay.
So 10 years later, right? And the traditional date for Herod's death was not established until 1896. So there were some mistakes in the Gregorian calendar, the well-known mistakes.
Yes.
And it was a Protestant theologian, a German named Schurer, who died in 1910, who really firmly established the death of Herod the Great as 4 BC.
Do you know the details of that? I'm just curious
How he
nailed that down.
I don't know.
Okay,
It was by examining the calendular errors of a previous calculation.
Gotcha.
Right. Not an easy word to say. It sounds too much like
calendular.
It's an adjective based on the word calends.
Yeah.
Right? Calendar. It sounds too much like glandular.
I was going to say that sounds like some kind of gland.
Yes, not a glandular error, a calendular
error.
Right.
Now, before we get too much deeper, I have a couple of questions, and I'm just curious.
Now, I may not have the answers.
I know that.
Okay.
But, so the traditions about who Luke was,
right?
And he's a doctor.
Yeah, he's mentioned as a dear physician in one of Paul's letters. I don't remember which one.
But do we know much about him, his background, like where he comes from? How does he get involved in all of this?
Well, he seems to have been a Hellenistic Jew.
Okay.
Right. So he had at least one Jewish parent, but he was raised as a Greek. He probably read the classics to some extent. He had a better education than most of the New Testament writers. Mm-hmm. The quality of his Greek is significantly better than, say, Mark's. It has more aspiration to style.
Okay.
It's not as complicated as the Greek of whoever wrote the book of Hebrews. Traditionally Paul, but now generally thought to be someone like Apollos, an Alexandrian Jew. But Luke's Greek is pretty good on the whole.
Okay.
And one of the traditions, which I think is quite likely, is that while Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea Philippi in perhaps 52 to 54 AD during that period, that because Luke was his companion, Luke may have spent that time traveling through Palestine, interviewing as many eyewitnesses or some of the eyewitnesses that he could have had access to, specifically Mary, Christ's mother.
Yeah.
So I find that quite plausible because first I believe it's inspired and accurate. And so how do we explain some of the details that Luke has about Mary's thoughts and the journey to Jerusalem when Christ was a 12-year-old or 13-year-old boy? Mm-hmm. How do we know those kinds of things, as well as the story of Elizabeth and Zacharias and the birth of John the Baptist?
Right.
How did he learn these things? Well,
yes.
There are a couple options, right? If you believe that it's all legend, well, Luke just made it up as a good storyteller.
Yep.
Or some kind of storyteller.
Yeah.
If you believe that it is true, you could believe that it was divinely told to him in a dictation kind of method, where the Holy Spirit just said, "This is what happened. Write it down." Mm-hmm. I don't accept that idea on the whole, because it's much more natural that he did what he said he did. He went and talked to people and studied and eyewitnesses and
Right.
Came up with an account.
Right, like you said, very Thucydidean.
Correct.
And given his background, it's not beyond the. It seems very likely that he probably would have known and read Thucydides himself.
Correct.
So Thucydides sets the standard for history writing. He says that
Absolutely.
if I didn't witness it myself, I talked to people who did.
That's right.
And that's going to be my standard.
Yep. And Herodotus, too, we should give him a little bit of credit.
Yeah.
I mean, he's kind of dismissed as more of a folklore kind of fellow, but he tried.
He tried, but he's a little bit more all over the map.
That's right. Two other quick facts about Luke. You asked previously, was he a physician? I looked it up. It's in Colossians chapter 4, where he's mentioned as a physician. And very interestingly, for the first time, Luke, in Acts chapter 16, Luke inserts himself into the narrative. In Luke chapter 16, verse 10, he says, when Paul had seen the vision of the man from Macedonia, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So prior to that, we are given a third-person view of Paul and Barnabas and Silas and all of their travels. This is the first time where Luke tells us, just by putting the verb in the first plural, that he has been with them at least part of the time.
Interesting. Excellent. That goes well beyond what I was expecting in the answer to my question. Right. And my second question was the dating of Luke's gospel. Do we have brackets for that?
Well, we can't get into this too deeply.
Okay, all right.
Because it's so controversial, at least among those who do not accept it as canon, as I do, as we do, as inspired. Mm-hmm. But it could have been as late as the 70s, I suppose.
Okay.
I tend to think it's much, much earlier because at the end of Acts, chapter 28, Luke tells us that Paul was just there in Rome under house arrest, preaching the gospel freely. Mm-hmm. So we know that that's probably 63 to 65.
Right.
It really can't be much later than that because I think it's likely that Paul was beheaded during the Neronian persecutions.
Yeah, I agree.
We've been to St. Paul's Basilica outside the walls.
Right.
We can't prove it, but I see no reason to disbelieve it.
Right.
And so if that is around 65, and if the Gospel of Luke was written before the Acts of the Apostles, which is very clear, at least from the beginning of Acts, where he says, in my former book, Theophilus.
Exactly.
Then that has to push the Gospel of Luke back to late 50s.
Yeah.
At least a draft, perhaps.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the view I hold.
So, certainly close enough to someone like Quirinius himself that if he had made this chronological error, he couldn't have gotten away with it just because, it was so long ago and people have forgotten about this.
Correct.
So it was close enough that would have been an obvious error for many, many people who were reading this thing.
Yes, it's interesting that you mentioned that because in the Smith article we just referenced, he talks about the fact that confusing the two different censuses. We haven't talked about the other census.
Okay.
But Luke in Acts chapter 5, in a speech of Gamaliel, when Peter and John are on trial before the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel mentions a revolt under someone named Judas the Galilean that took place at the time of the census. And so we know that was under Quirinius, and that was in 6 or 7 A.D.
Yes.
So that's the one census that we can very specifically date.
Okay.
Right? So Luke mentions that one, and so why would he mention a first one if he is just making it up completely?
Right. And he uses the adjective prote.
That's
right?
correct.
So it's a first census.
Right. So we're going to talk about that at length later on.
Okay.
Because I think that there's a better way to translate it based on the article of Thorley and the other individual that I was studying, Thorley and Pearson.
Okay.
And so there's a better way to translate it than it is generally taken, which actually resolves a lot of these problems.
Interesting. Shall we drag Josephus into this?
Yes, because we need to know who is Quirinius.
Yes.
And we have two excellent sources, literary sources for Quirinius. The first is Josephus, his Jewish Antiquities, and the second is the Roman historian Tacitus, and then we may have inscriptional evidence as well for Quirinius. So, Jeff, I'd like to start by reading a little bit of the Greek of Josephus, since, this episode is kind of Greek-themed.
Yes.
And then maybe you can read some of the translation.
Yes.
All right. So this is from the Antiquities of Josephus, book 18, and it goes like this. Quirinios, there's Quirinius, Quirinius de ton esten boulein synagomenon aner, tas te alas arkas epitetelekos kai dia pason hot deusas hupatas genesthai, tata alla axiomati megas sun aligois episurias parain, hupa kaisaros dikaiadates tu ethnus apostalmenos kai timetes ton usion genesomenos.
Very nicely done.
Thank you.
Yes, and Josephus, his dates, when is he writing?
He's a contemporary of Titus and was in the entourage of Titus.
That's right.
You know, the famous general who got an arch when he destroyed Jerusalem in 70.
Gotcha.
So I think that Josephus was perhaps born in the 40s.
Okay.
Maybe the late 20s, I'm not sure, AD, and died at the beginning of the 2nd century.
So very close, if not contemporaneous, with Luke himself.
Absolutely contemporaneous. Yep.
So this Cyrenius, as it's in the translation I have here, that's the same as Quirinius.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So now Cyrenius, a Roman senator and one who had gone through other majesties, had passed through them until he had been consul, and one who, on other accounts, was of great dignity, came at this time into Syria, with a few others being sent by Caesar to be a judge of that nation, and to take an account of their substance. Coponius, also a man of the equestrian order, was sent together with him, to have the supreme power over the Jews. Moreover, Cyrenius came himself into Judea, which was now added to the province of Syria, to take an account of their substance and to dispose of Archelaus's money. But the Jews, although at the beginning they took the report of a taxation heinously, yet did they leave off any farther opposition to it by the persuasion of Joazar, who was the son of Boethus and high priest. So they, being overpersuaded by Joazar's words, gave an account of their estates without any dispute about it. Yet there was one Judas, a Galileite, of a city whose name was Gamala, who, taking with him Sadduc a Pharisee, became zealous to draw them to a revolt, who both said that this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery, and exhorted the nation to assert their liberty.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is then the later census, the one of 6 or 7, which we have from Josephus for sure, was conducted under 2 men, Quirinius and Coponius, who were governing Syria together at the time.
Okay.
I love this translation. Did you see the source there?
It's a one William Whiston?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometime professor of mathematics in the University of Cambridge, London, 1737.
Going back to the 18th century.
Yes. Okay. But what's so charming to me about this is that, you know, this guy, Whiston, he was a professor of mathematics at Cambridge, and yet he translated all of Josephus from, you know, Greek into English.
Wow.
So
when men were men.
I guess so. He could do a number of different things.
That's amazing.
So this is the census that's referred to in Acts chapter 5, as I was just mentioning, from Gamaliel.
Right.
And so what we see, right, is that they, at the beginning, they were upset about the notion of taxation, yet they left off any farther opposition to it, and then there was this revolt of Judas the Gaulonite, or Judas the Galilean, as it's translated in Acts 5. So we have all of the elements here of corroboration of Luke's account,
right,
from a source that's not Christian in any sense, or even sympathetic to Christianity.
Right.
Josephus. Right?
Yes.
He places Quirinius in Syria. He confirms Acts 5, and Quirinius is conducting a census for the purposes of taxation.
Right.
The problem, of course, then is...
It's the time problem.
It's the time problem.
Yes.
Unless Luke 2 is translated in a little different way.
Which we're going to get to?
That's correct.
Okay, gotcha.
Which we're going to get to...
After the break?
There you go.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the good people at Ratio Coffee. Ratio Coffee, they've been with us not as long as Hackett has been, but they have been a great supporter of the podcast for quite some time now.
Quite a long time.
Right, and their excellent support is as excellent as the coffee that their great machines brew.
Wow, that wasn't easy to say, Jeff.
It wasn't.
You must be fully caffeinated.
Something like that, right?
Did you have a cup of coffee from your Ratio this morning?
Of course, man. And you know, there's something about having all that snow on the ground.
Yes.
It's icy and windy and cold outside, but you have this gentle machine brewing this great cup of coffee. You can stare out at the blizzard on the other side of the window.
With impunity.
Yeah,
you feel like a champion, don't you?
It's a beautiful thing. So,
right.
Yes, of course I made coffee for myself and my wife this morning. Just the elegant way that the hand-blown glass carafe pours that stuff is just, it's a thing of beauty.
It is. I got a nice Christmas present from one of my children.
Yes?
A little bag of, premium roasted coffee beans, a company called Intelligentsia.
Nice.
You've heard of them probably, Chicago brewers. No connection to this podcast. Probably we're going to get slapped with a lawsuit or something. But anyway,
Yeah.
tasted fantastic when brewed in my Ratio 8.
Ratio 8. We're both using the Ratio 8 right
That's
now.
correct.
Yes. Not that long ago, I had the Ratio 6 going, which is another wonderful machine. The thing I loved about my 6, it had the weighty carafe that kept the coffee hot for hours without any kind of roasting pad.
I got the carafe for the 8.
Do you?
You're still using the hand-blown borosilicate glass?
I am.
Like a Neanderthal? No, I'm kidding.
No,
that thing is a work of art itself.
Exactly. It belongs in the Louvre.
That's right.
Yes. So, listeners, if you want one of these wonderful machines, the Ratio 6 or the Ratio 8, please go to ratiocoffee.com.
RATIO coffee.com
and choose the machine, the one that you want, or both.
Right.
And type in the coupon code ANCOK5.
ANCOK5. K for kitchen.
Yes.
Kitchen 5.
What's the 5 for?
I don't know.
It's the number right before the 6 or the 8?
That's true. No,
Yes.
on a scale of 1 to 5.
It's a 5.
It's a 5.
There we go.
And you could be brewing in 2023 in the new year. It's time to, go into the new year with some fresh brew, I would say.
I would say so. Step it up. Step up your brew game.
That's correct. This is a chance to support this humble podcast and score some delicious coffee.
Right. So you type in that coupon code and you will get 15% off your entire order.
You will not regret it. Jeff and dear listener, this episode is also brought to you by the great folks at Hackett Publishing. Hackett, with offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts and Indianapolis, Indiana, have been providing first-rate translations of the classics and many other areas of literature to a broad audience for 50 years.
50 years. This is the anniversary year. We're still in it. We're just barely in it.
We're barely in it, just for a few more days.
Yes. No, I agree. We've talked so much on the podcast how much we love the translations from Hackett. We use them all the time on the podcast.
Right.
If you've been tuning into the Virgil episodes, we've been leaning on Stanley Lombardo's wonderful translation of the Aeneid.
But you can also pick up the verse translation by Len Krizak.
Exactly. And they're both published by Hackett.
That's correct.
How many publishers do that? Not many.
Not many. And they do the same for Ovid, right? They have both the Ambrose and the Lombardo translation of the Metamorphoses. They have translations of the Iliad, the Odyssey, more than one different author in the Plato series, a brand new series on Aristotle. I'm sure that they have Thucydides. We know they do. Herodotus. Pretty much everyone we've mentioned in this show for 107 episodes has been covered by Hackett.
Right. And as you alluded to earlier, they don't just do translations, they do publications of all kinds of scholarly work on all corners of the academic world. Listeners, go to hackettpublishing.com, HACKETT publishing.com. Just scroll through their huge, tremendous, wonderful catalog. It's just great viewing. Find the books that you want, and then type in this code, AN2022.
That's correct.
That's ad nauseum 2022, the current year. And that will get you 2 wonderful things, 20% off your entire order and free shipping.
That's correct. See if you can find a cover of one of the classical works that you love as much as Jeff loves.
Yes.
The cover of Euripides' Bacchae.
That's great.
With Elvis Presley, or the Iliad with the D-Day landing. And what is the Odyssey?
The Odyssey is the famous Earthrise, the shot of the Earth from the moon.
That's correct. And the Aeneid is the Vietnam Memorial.
Yes, yeah. It's brilliant.
It is really brilliant.
Yeah, just
nicely done.
Scroll through, see what you can find there. Yeah, and find the one you love and let us know.
You will not regret it. This episode is also brought to you by the wonderful music of a Mr. Jeff Sheets.
That's the guy at the top of the show?
That's correct. With the angels we have heard on high, the Christmas-themed ripping guitar, and the well-timed rhythmic drums and bass coming in and so forth. That's Jeff Sheets.
I love the harmonizing guitar lines.
Yeah,
that's great stuff.
Yeah, and we're going to conclude with some of that too for our outro music. Keeping up kind of the tradition of going a little bit different around the holidays.
Right.
So Jeff is a world-class guitarist, and JeffSheets.com, SCHEETZ. And a very generous musician, giving us this music for free to use on the podcast. Lives out there in Kansas, somewhere like that. Just a kind of a really incredible guy.
Fantastic.
He's a fly fisher. He trains jumping dogs.
Does he really?
Yeah, he does.
He does it all.
He does it and plays the guitar like unbelievable.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, Jeff, as we get back into it now, we move on from Josephus and his evidence for the character and history of Quirinius to a Roman historian.
To Tacitus.
That's correct.
Who also mentions this guy.
That's correct, writing in Latin.
All right. You want to read a little bit of Latin?
I would. It's been mostly a Greek theme, and I'm not going to read all of this Tacitus, but just a little bit. And those who are listening carefully, which I'm sure is everyone, they will notice that Tacitus is a master of Latin style and quite different than almost anything we've read on the podcast before.
Fantastic. Let's hear it.
All right. Sub idem tempus ut mors Sulpicii Quirini publicis exequiis frequentaretur petivet a senatu. Nihil adverem et patriciam Sulpiciorum familiam Quirinius pertinuit, ortus apud municipium Lanuvium, sed impeger militii et acribus ministeriis consulatum sub divo Augusto, there's the guy, mox expugnatis per Ciliciam homonadensium, castellis insignia triumphi adeptus, datusque rector Gaio Caesari Armeniam obtinenti.
Very nice.
Thanks. Seemed like a good place to stop there right before we got to Tiberius.
Okay. All right.
So where's this from? I'm sorry, before you read the translation.
This is this is from Tacitus Annales, book 3, chapter 48.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
And
thanks.
and I'm going to give you Alfred John Church's translation. About the same time, he requested the Senate to let the death of Sulpicius Quirinius be celebrated with a public funeral. With the old patrician family of the Sulpicii, this Quirinius, who was born in the town of Lanuvium, was quite unconnected. An indefatigable soldier, he had by his zealous services won the consulship under the divine Augustus, and subsequently the honors of a triumph for having stormed some fortresses of the Homonadenses in Cilicia. He was also appointed advisor to Gaius Caesar in the government of Armenia, and had likewise paid court to Tiberius, who was then at Rhodes. The emperor now made all this known to the Senate, and extolled the good offices of Quirinius to himself, while he censured Marcus Lollius, whom he charged with encouraging Gaius Caesar in his perverse and quarrelsome behavior. But people generally had no pleasure in the memory of Quirinius because of the perils he had brought, as I have related, on Lepida, and the meanness and dangerous power of his last years.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, so he kind of fell out of favor as he went on. Okay.
Lepida was his wife. And apparently he was a brute to her. And so near the end of his life, although he, had this distinguished military career previously, like you said, fell out of favor. So what do we gain from this? Well, we know that Quirinius, right, Gaius Sulpicius Quirinius, was an historical character, right? So Luke is obviously right about that. And that he was in the region. He was there fighting against the Homonadenses in Cilicia. So this is...
He got a triumph for this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So not an inconspicuous individual.
No.
Right? You want to explain to the audience for a minute what a triumph is? Because that might be somewhat unfamiliar.
So if a general or a military leader won a victory of some of distinction,
right?
The Senate could vote that they could hold a triumph, which is kind of a public parade.
Yes.
In Rome, where you could be celebrated in a chariot and display all the spoils of war.
Right.
It was kind of the highest mark of honor that a military leader could have.
Yes, and you parade through the streets of the city of Rome, right?
Yeah.
When people would hang from the balconies, and it's like a ticker tape parade.
Exactly.
Kind of. So this guy Quirinius, this is what he did. He was a favorite of Augustus for a while and spent some time there. So that places him in the region. Now, there's a lot more depth here we could get into for establishing the dates he was there, having to do with the roads that were built through the region of Asia Minor and some of the road markers that help us date Quirinius. But again, we keep coming back to this problem, which is he wasn't in Syria at the right time, according to most evidence we have, to have conducted this census before the death of Herod the Great.
Right. Okay. But there is some evidence that might explain this problem.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're next going to look at, as the plot thickens, inscriptional evidence, which comes from 1764.
Okay.
And the key word here is iterum.
Iterum. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right, which means?
Again.
I said iterum.
Iterum.
Which means?
Again.
Iterum, Jeff.
Yes. Okay, how long are we going to do this?
I don't know.
This is Abbott Costello.
What's wrong with that?
Nothing wrong with that.
They like a good snowstorm. Yeah, so it all turns, it hinges on whether or not this word iterum in the inscription refers to Quirinius.
Okay.
So to explain this, we need to go to a more recent article by a scholar named Edward Dobrova.
Okay. All right, so what does this Dobrova say about this inscription, this iterum.
Okay, so the title of the work, the title of the article is The Date of the Census of Quirinius and the Chronology of the Governors of the Province of Syria.
Okay.
And it's from a German journal. So here goes. My apologies to all of you who know German really well. It's from the Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik.
Okay. Yeah.
2011.
I always just call that ZPE.
Yes, is that right?
Zippy.
You have a few copies of it sitting on your coffee table at home.
I do.
Bowl of breakfast cereal and just, skim through it a little bit.
Yeah, what's in Zippy today?
That's right. So this was published in 2011. This is taken from page 138, where he says, an excellent example of these interpretive problems with respect to inscriptions is provided by the so-called Titulus Tiburtinus.
Okay.
So the Tivoli placard. This is part of an inscription found in 1764 near Tivoli, the classical Tibur, containing a partially preserved cursus honorum. Now, again, for the audience, Jeff, the cursus honorum.
It's kind of the path of upper class Roman's career.
Correct.
Like, the kind of the offices, you start at the bottom, but you work your way up, with the goal becoming consul at the top. Yes.
Right. So just like you and I, we start with a small podcast, right? Then we're hosts on, MSNBC.
Yeah.
Pretty soon we're White House correspondents.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's our cursus honorum.
Right.
So it's he says a partially preserved cursus honorum held by an anonymous senator from the time of Augustus. Based on the preserved section of the inscription, we can state that this senator belonged to the highest echelons of the Roman political elite. This is shown by the functions he occupied and honors he was awarded after leading a victorious martial campaign. He was proconsul of Asia, as well as governor of Syria, starting to get the picture, probably around the end of the 1st century BC. In the inscription, the title associated with the latter position, governor of Syria, is preceded by the word iterum. Again, since the text is incomplete, it can be interpreted in various ways.
Okay.
So here's the problem. Does it refer to Quirinius, or does it refer to another individual, Centinus?
I see. Because the inscription does not, we don't get the name.
That's right. It's partly damaged. Partly damaged. The state in which the document is preserved, however, does not permit any certainty, says Dubrova, as to the correctness of the identification of this senator. And then in parentheses, a sizable group of scholars argues that this inscription refers to other governors of Syria or to the reconstruction of the course of his career.
Okay.
So apparently it's not a silver bullet, right?
Gotcha.
If it really for sure referred to Quirinius, with the inclusion of the word iterum, it would establish that he was in Syria twice.
Gotcha.
Therefore, he could have been there earlier for the census that Luke talks about, prior to 4 BC, and he could also have been there for the census of 6 or 7 that Luke mentions in Acts chapter 5.
Okay. Now, given all the problems with that evidence, wouldn't again the theory that he was a governor of Syria earlier than the time that we know he was in 6 or 7 AD, wouldn't that also kind of align with Luke's adjective prote? He was the first census.
Well, you're anticipating all of this so well, Jeff.
Okay.
It's like you've read all of these articles and you've done all the homework.
All right, so I'm on the right track here?
Well, this is one of the solutions, and that is that the proper way to interpret prote is to say that this is earlier than, prior to,
I see,
the one that Quirinius conducted, the more famous one that's mentioned in Acts chapter 5, and took place in 6 or 7 AD. And I'm not completely persuaded that that's the best solution to this problem, but I'm getting there.
Okay.
And I want to look at the evidence, when we get right up to the end of the episode.
All right.
But just this concluding quote from the Dubrova article, page 141. The chronological elements contained in the inscriptions from the standard do not offer a significant change in our knowledge of the status of Judea under the rule of Herod as a vassal state.
Okay.
So that's his conclusion.
Okay.
No silver bullet. Sorry, this doesn't solve the problem.
Okay. All right. So he's just raising questions and just kind of leaving us hanging out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's aporetic. No clear conclusion that
All
we
right.
would like. You never make it onto, unsolved mysteries, on the History Channel, because those always wrap up more or less.
Very nice and neatly. Yes.
But before we get on, to trying to solve the third problem, which is the Quirinius issue, let's take a closer look at the first and second ones.
Okay.
Which are, first of all, apart from the gospel, history knows nothing of a general imperial census in the time of Augustus.
Okay.
And the second one, there could have been no Roman census in Palestine during the time of Herod the Great, who was a Rex Socius, an allied king.
Okay. All right. So let's turn to this article by Brooke Pearson.
Okay.
And this comes from Catholic Biblical Quarterly back in April of 1999, an article titled "The Lucan Censuses Revisited." And he has this very striking statement here. He writes, Sherwin White, another scholar, has stated that a provincial census in Judea in the time of the kingdom is an impossibility. This statement is true in the sense that there was certainly no provincial census under Herod's rule. But the supposition that there was a census in Herod's kingdom is necessary for much of the material in Josephus to make sense.
Can I just interrupt you for a minute here?
Yeah.
Okay, so just to tease this out a little bit, a provincial census is one undertaken by the Roman Empire, by Augustus or someone like that, in a particular province at his command and his entire direction.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so Sherwin White says, impossible.
No, it couldn't have happened.
Couldn't have happened.
Yep.
You never do that in a province when there's a Rex Socius in charge.
Right. And Pearson agrees.
Okay.
He says there was certainly no provincial census under Herod. But he says that the supposition that there was a census in Herod's kingdom is necessary for much of the material in Josephus to make sense.
Okay.
Contrary to received opinion on the matter, Josephus records a great deal of indirect evidence that a careful and detailed system of census and taxation existed under Herod.
Okay.
So he's making the argument that just by the detail that Josephus gives us, that there had to have been something like a census to have been taken in Palestine.
Right.
So Herod was up to something, but not under the banner or under the terminology that is usually associated with this question.
Right.
Okay.
Very clear. Good. So then we're going to look at another article. This is by Lily Ross Taylor. This is the oldest in a list of articles that we surveyed for this episode.
Okay.
So this was published in TAPA, right? American Journal of Philology, 1933.
Okay.
And published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So this is from an article entitled Quirinius and the Census of Judea, Lily Ross Taylor, and this begins on page 131. Quote, Luke's statement that every man was commanded to go to his own city to be enrolled has significant parallels in Egyptian records. Among the papyri dealing with the census held in Egypt every 14 years during the empire are various documents providing for the enrollment by household, he kata oikian apographe. So the apographe, that means a census or an enrollment. Your name has to be written down, and that's specifically mentioned in the Luke 2, verse 1 portion that we read.
Yes.
And according to Egyptian records, it was a he kata oikian apographe. That is a household by household census, which is significant for this argument. So then Taylor goes on, one of them, dating from 104 AD, is a command of the prefect of Egypt that those outside their own home return to their own households to be enrolled. Still other records, the relation of which to the census seems now to be established, mention not the household but the idea, the place of origin to which men could on an occasion like the taking of the census be forced to return. The idea of the idea was familiar elsewhere in the East. Whatever our decision about the historical accuracy of Luke, he seems to have been recording a custom familiar in Judea when he says that everyone was ordered to go to his own city, Eistain Idian Polin, to be enrolled.
Interesting. So so it's clear for the audience, when she's talking about Egyptian evidence, she's talking about Hellenized Roman Egypt.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, not hieroglyphs,
Right.
Not bird, owl, something like that.
I.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the date there was something like early 2nd century?
Yeah, 104 AD.
So not that far removed.
100 years.
From what we're talking about.
Right. So all of this would be classed by a skeptic as, oh, come on, that's highly circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
And it is circumstantial evidence. But it proves that Luke is talking about things that are not completely fabricated.
Right. He's not making this up out of whole cloth.
If one wants to conclude that he's wrong on the details, well, okay. But he's not talking about things that are totally foreign to his audience.
Yeah.
There's very secure evidence that the kinds of things he's describing took place close by.
Yes. Good.
So we bring in some other evidence here. And this is from Smith
Yes.
Okay.
From the article we quoted earlier.
Correct.
Right. He writes, it is commonly asserted that Quirinius' census was part of a worldwide census, and that this census requires citizens to go to their ancestral homes to register. The first assertion is demonstrably false, since Augustus could not commission a worldwide census and does not appear to have commissioned an empire-wide census. Here the confusion is based upon a forced interpretation of Luke's statement that Augustus issued a decree that the whole world be registered.
Right.
Okay.
So the next part there about the hyperbole, I think, is really interesting also.
Oh,
If maybe you could read that.
Yeah, let me carry on. Luke's statement is a simple case of hyperbole, akin to Matthew's statement that all Judea was going out to be baptized by John. No sensible ancient reader would be bothered or surprised by such a statement. Perhaps Luke meant to refer to the census of Judea as part of a larger census-taking strategy on the part of Augustus. There is no way of being sure, however, and it would not have mattered to Luke or to his audience. Anyone living at that time would know that emperors at various times commissioned censuses and might well do so in provinces other than their own. They would read nothing more into Luke's hyperbole. Rather, the description of the census in this way sets a tone of global proportions. The events surrounding the birth of Jesus were of more than merely local significance.
Yeah, I found that really persuasive.
Yeah.
And really interesting because, growing up as a child, I think I read it first in the King James. A decree went out that the whole world be registered.
Right.
It seems very comprehensive. And, I didn't have any reason to disbelieve it, nor do I now. But if you understand it properly, it's much more plausible to think that Augustus was in the process of keeping good accounts of everyone.
Right.
And it had now reached the place and the time where this could at least begin to be done in Judea.
Right. I find that very persuasive as well.
The first time I heard about it, I thought, Joseph received an envelope in the mail, right? That said, okay, report to Bethlehem.
Right.
That's not really what happened.
Yeah.
It's a much larger undertaking, especially since so many of these people were illiterate and didn't have maybe fixed addresses and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting, Jeff, Smith's speculation here about why maybe Joseph would have gone to Bethlehem.
Yeah, for a tax rebate.
Yes, a potential tax loophole.
Yeah.
I think that's worth sharing with the audience. What do you think?
Yeah, this is great. So Smith writes, another possible reason why Joseph may have gone to Bethlehem grows out of studies of Hellenistic censuses in Egypt, which gave a tax reduction of as much as 50% to those who resided in metropoles. Because of the proximity of Bethlehem to Jerusalem, Joseph may have been eligible for the reduced rate, which would never have been the case in Nazareth, and by registering his newborn child in the same place, he would make the child eligible for the same exemption when he came of age. So not just a tax loophole for himself, but he's passing it on to his son.
Right.
All right. Yeah. So perhaps both of these reasons work together so that Joseph went to Bethlehem to maintain the legal status of his property as well as to take advantage of a tax loophole.
Right. So that first part there, the legal status of his property. So this is the notion that because he was descended from the line of David, right, therefore he had some small property, perhaps in Bethlehem, to which he had a legal claim, even though, or it could have been a large property. There is a tradition that Joseph was not a carpenter, but a mason. And so that therefore he had property in Bethlehem and in Nazareth. And so he could choose which one to claim as the part that would be taxed.
Gotcha.
Because although he's not a Roman citizen, he's a subject of a province, and so he has to pay taxes.
Yeah.
It's a common theme throughout the Gospels, right? Is it right or wrong to pay taxes to Caesar? And there was a lot of disagreement, so that Christ even had one disciple known as Simon the Zealot,
right,
who refused to pay taxes, apparently, until Christ corrected him.
Right. So Smith's arguing because Bethlehem was kind of considered kind of Jerusalem Heights.
Right. It was in the proximity of Jerusalem.
So that's
there was
where
an exemption.
You could get the rebate.
Yeah, by living in the big city. So that is speculative. But I think that, if we're going to speculate about Luke falsifying things, it's okay to, do a little bit of speculation, perhaps, in terms of how did it play out specifically?
Yeah. All right, Dave, is there any evidence you want to get to before we get down to kind of the serious issue of the chronology and the translation, a piece from Luke 2? Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to look at a little quote here from a scholar named Wayne Brindle.
Okay.
And this was published in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, JETS, 1984.
Okay.
This is from a reprint, page 51. He says, some have questioned whether Rome would try to take a census in Palestine while Herod was still reigning. So this is the Rex Socius issue once again. Josephus indicates that serious problems developed during the latter part of Herod's reign between Herod and Augustus. His responses to his family troubles, that is Herod's, executing sons and changing his will, began to damage his reputation with Caesar. In addition, in 8 BC, Herod led an attack into Arabia to punish robbers who were Augustus's subjects, and Augustus reacted strongly. Then Brindle quotes from Josephus from the Antiquities, chapter 16. Caesar grew very angry and wrote to Herod sharply. The sum of his epistle was this, that whereas of old he had used him as his friend, considered him as his friend, he should now use him as his subject. So Augustus is upset with Herod. To continue Brindle, apparently in Herod's last days, his kingdom came more and more under the direction and influence of Augustus. It would not be surprising, therefore, to find the emperor asking Herod to take a census for him in Judea. So this undercuts, right? This undercuts the notion you never have a client king taking a Roman census.
Right.
Augustus was probably anticipating Herod's death, says Brindle. As far as the manner in which the census was carried out is concerned, here Brindle's quotes from another scholar, and he says, Herod was naturally eager to avoid giving to the enrollment an entirely foreign and non-national character. Obviously, the best way to soothe the Jewish sentiment, because the Jews did not like Herod, he was not a native-born Jew,
right,
was to give the enrollment a tribal character and to number the tribes of Israel, as had been done by purely national governments.
Oh.
So here's another potential way to understand it, right?
Gotcha, yeah.
That Herod said, well, let's talk about it in terms of the 12 tribes, and therefore I'll get what I want.
Yeah.
But they won't be quite as opposed to me because it represents something about their heritage.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. Oh, so again, hugely circumstantial.
Yes.
Right.
Very circumstantial.
But intriguing nonetheless.
Correct.
Right. So, what about this, the translation?
Yes.
In Luke 2. Let's get down to this.
Right. So we're going to look at the question of, did Quirinius serve 2 terms? Mm-hmm. Right. Does this somehow reconcile the chronology? On the whole, the evidence says no, he did not serve 2 terms. Maybe the inscription from Tivoli.
The iterum?
Right, the iterum
yeah.
again. Maybe the inscription supports it, but it's just not conclusive.
Yeah.
Was it someone else? There's something we haven't mentioned throughout the whole episode, and that is the church father Tertullian, who is generally very well informed about Roman practices. He says that it did not take place under a man named Quirinius, but the man Gaius Sentius Saturninus. And he mentions this in 207, so only 200 years after the event. Mm-hmm. The problem is there's no indication that the text of Luke is corrupt there. That the New Testament is, by and large, very well secured as to what the text really says.
Right.
There's only one manuscript of Catullus, for example.
Yes.
There's more than 10,000 manuscripts of the New Testament.
Right.
So we have a very good idea of what the New Testament says, even in troubling passages, and there's nothing there to substitute.
Okay, yeah.
So we have to dismiss Tertullian's suggestion out of hand because it just doesn't fit the evidence.
Okay.
So now we come right down to it.
The Greek itself.
To the Greek itself.
Okay.
Have there been mistranslations? So we're going to look at 2 articles. First of all, Thorley, and then we're going to go back to Pearson to wrap it all up.
All right. What does the Thorley article have to say about this?
Yeah, so this is from the journal Greece and Rome, and published in 1979. The article is entitled The Nativity Census, What Does Luke Actually Say? By John Thorley. So I'm going to start at page 82. For the phrase haute apographe prote, there's that prote, agenita, he gemoneontos te surias kureniu, the New English Bible offers this, quote, this was the first registration of its kind. It took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Why of its kind, asks Thorley. Luke does not say this, and whatever this census was, it was certainly not the first of its kind in any absolute sense. It may have been the first census in Judea, but if this is what Luke was saying, he would surely have been aware of an ambiguity in stating that it took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria, since Quirinius was also governor of Syria in AD 6, when he was responsible for taking a census in Judea on its annexation as a Roman province. Luke himself refers to this event in Acts 5:37. That's the revolt under Judas the Galilean.
Yes.
And Luke can hardly have been unaware of Quirinius' involvement, says Thorley, nor indeed can he have believed that the nativity took place on the occasion of the census in AD 6, right? Most translations in English and in other languages do indeed suggest that Luke is at very least guilty of historical vagueness. In English, only 2 versions incorporate into their texts another interpretation, which allows that Luke was being far more specific. The Revised Version of 1881 says, quote, "This was the first enrollment made when Quirinius was governor of Syria." And the NIV says, 1973, the one you read from, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. To put it more fully, what Luke is actually saying is that this was the first census to take place while Quirinius happened to be governor of Syria, thus distinguishing it from the second census made when Quirinius was similarly governor of Syria in AD 6.
Yes.
Luke's Greek surely allows no other sensible and unambiguous interpretation.
Okay.
Finally, it might be objected that if Luke had meant the first of 2 censuses, he would have written protera, which is the comparative.
Yes.
But in Acts 1:1, Luke uses proton in exactly this way. In my first book, proton. And indeed, proteros was never obligatory in this sense. It must be said that several commentators have acknowledged this interpretation as a possible meaning of the Greek text, and the translators of the New English Bible inserted it as a footnote.
Okay. So that would be an argument that would line up with seeing the Tivoli inscription as being that he was governor twice.
That's correct.
And this was the census that took place during the first.
And there were 2 of them.
There were 2 of them.
I think an even better interpretation is given by Pearson of the Greek text, and you're going to read that portion for us, I believe, right?
Yes. So Pearson writes this, perhaps the most serious reason why there is continuing skepticism regarding the Lucan census, despite the evidence marshaled above, is that the grammar of Luke 2:2 is thought to be at odds with the evidence. Luke 2, verse 2, is usually translated as something like, "This was the first census while Quirinius was governing Syria." But several grammatical points need to be examined before any understanding can be accepted. 1, the use and meaning of the superlative adjective protos. 2, the relationship of prote to the other elements in the sentence. 3, the sense of the genitive absolute. And 4, the sense of ageneto and its relationship to the other elements in the sentence. Ramsey argues for the true superlative sense of protos, saying that in Luke 2:2, prote was not used in its frequently occurring Hellenistic comparative sense. Ramsey bases this on his argument that this census was simply the first of many. However, this requires the reference to Quirinius in this verse to be a reference to his first legateship of the 2, the second being that of 6-7 CE AD. Nigel Turner, arguing that the sense should be this census was prior to the census of Quirinius on the basis of the attested ellipses in other comparative uses, as in John 5:3-6 and 1 Corinthians 1:25, also suggests that in Luke 2:2, the superlative prote is used in its Hellenistic comparative sense.
So just to interrupt for a moment,
Yes.
to keep the audience up to speed here, this suggestion is that prote should mean here earlier. So this was earlier than the census that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Yes.
So the famous one is in AD 6, which occasioned the revolt. Luke in chapter 2 is not talking about that one. He's saying this one that I'm mentioning may not have been conducted by Quirinius.
Right.
But it was before the famous one conducted by Quirinius.
Yes, exactly.
So if you want to continue, was it Heichelheim?
Yes. So he says, Heichelheim's solution concurs largely with Turner's, but more for several of the historical reasons which have been outlined above than for grammatical ones. Sherwin-White, in response, states that Heichelheim's and other suggestion that prote in Luke 3, verse 2, means comparative proteron could only be accepted if supported by a parallel in Luke himself. This is not a viable argument, however. We must examine not only Luke, but also the Hellenistic Greek in which he wrote. The comparative sense of the superlative adjective in Hellenistic usage is well attested, and we do not even have to go outside the New Testament itself to find it. With bodies of writing as small as those of the New Testament books, it is much more difficult than many think to establish the style or regular usage of any particular writer.
Yeah, that is an excellent point.
Yeah.
This is a typical, I think, mistake that is made in these kinds of things. You have a very small sample, right? You have 2 scrolls, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. on the assumption, which I take to be true, they're written by the same author, that's all you have.
Right.
You can't draw large-scale conclusions about what the author would or would not have done in any given instance based on such a small sample.
Exactly. Right. But like you were saying, his use of prote or protos in reference to his book, that would line up with the same kind of usage of this use of prote in this passage.
You mean in Acts 1?
Yes.
Yeah. In my former book, Theophilus.
Yes.
Right. So that's a pretty good argument, I would say. And shall we wrap up with Pearson's conclusion?
Yes, let's do it.
Because I think this is a good place to end. And then we can wait for the questions, the comments, the criticisms to roll in along the lines of, gentlemen, you didn't solve anything.
Right.
You didn't shed any light. You just, stretched out the darkness. So this is from page, what is it?
282.
282 of Pearson's article, where it says, translated out of its context, this verse makes very little sense and creates a plethora of problems. However, in the face of the evidence, one, that Herod must have kept accurate records of census and taxation. Any problems with that claim? What do you think?
I don't see any problems with that claim.
Yeah, I don't think it's the case that he must have kept accurate records of census and taxation, but he certainly was highly motivated to do so.
Right.
In order to keep on Augustus's good side and to make as much money as possible, right? Point two, he most likely used the census in ways very similar to those of his Roman overlords, both to collect taxes and to exercise strict social control over an unruly people.
Seems likely.
Correct. 3, many indirect statements in Josephus square with what we know of the census process in other Roman territories. 4, that one of the offices of the census process is mentioned by Josephus in such a way as to assume that the process was a part of everyday life. So that's the interesting part, Jeff, about how you get the impression when you read it, at least I did as a child, that this was, the first thing that ever kind of happened, and it was so unusual. But no, it was just a common practice.
Right. Yeah. I when I was a kid too, I took that. That's why Luke mentions it, because it was so rare.
Correct.
Right.
But it's really the opposite.
Opposite. Yes.
Right. And 5, that each and every aspect of the census, as it is described by Luke, has close parallels in other parts of the Roman Empire. So that's the Hellenistic Egyptian evidence that we talked about, a household census. The conclusion is, says Pearson, we would do better to take a plausible grammatical solution which accords with the evidence rather than to ignore the evidence on the basis of shaky grammar. The meaning suggested for this verse, quote, this registration was earlier than or before Quirinius governed in Syria, works in terms of context rather than in terms of a predetermined prejudice to find contradictions in the narrative.
I find that very persuasive.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
All things, being equal, given that, yes, some of this evidence is circumstantial, we'd really like that inscription to contain an iterum, and again, that refers directly to Quirinius, so that he was there both times.
Yes.
But even without that, I find this interpretation of the Greek text very plausible.
Yeah. And part of me just loves that this kind of stuff can come down to just one, 5-character word.
Yeah, prote.
Right? Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so going through this episode reminded me of an episode we did very, very early, number 5 or 6, I think, History and the Trojan War, which, was surprisingly popular because I thought nobody's going to like that. It's so dry, right? But, it had some success. And so preparing for this one seemed kind of similar, kind of doing some historical sleuthing or trying to.
Yeah, I love this stuff. I hope the audience does too. I think this is so interesting. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jeff, we got to get out of here, don't we?
We do. But before we do, Dave, could you tell us a little bit about the Moss method?
I'd love to do that.
Okay.
So the Moss method for Greek, if you want to be able to read, the New Testament, Josephus Antiquities, some Herodotus, Thucydides, the things we've talked about on the podcast, you can go to mossmethod.com and you can check out my program, which will take you from
neophyte to erudite.
That's correct. And it teaches you the basics of Greek from the ground up. I'm having a 24-hour flash sale.
What? When did this happen? Just now?
No, I thought about it earlier today, but I'm announcing it just now. A 24-hour flash sale on New Year's Eve. It's going to go from 12:01 a.m. On December 31, 2022, and it's going to end at 11:59 p.m. on that same day.
Okay.
This is the only time I've done this. You can get 15% off. I've never offered this large of a discount.
Fantastic.
Go into the new year learning some Greek. Go go to mossmethod.com for the one-day flash sale.
Excellent. Now, what about LLPSI?
Thanks for asking, Jeff. I'm doing the same thing.
Okay.
For the Lingua Latina per se illustrata, that is Hans Orberg's fabulous text for learning Latin, I've put together a program that contains 33 instructional videos with a live studio audience where I'm teaching other Latin students of various degrees of competence from the ground up ab initio, and covers the first 9 chapters of the famous Hans Orberg book. So especially if you are a Latin teacher and you're teaching the active method, you want to learn how to speak some Latin, this will do it for you. Qui casus est? What's the case? Quid genus? What's the gender? Very useful in the classroom. Go to latinperdiem.com/LLPSI and get that special 24-hour flash sale.
Fantastic. All right, and also before we go, we got to thank a number of people.
Of course.
Mishka, as
Yes.
always, number one, our great engineer who puts this all together in record time.
Every time. We
Every
make such demands on her, and she says, no problem, I'll do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also to Scott Van Zen and Ken Tamplin for the great music you hear throughout, and for this episode to Jeff Sheets.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Ken provides us that great bumper music for the ads, and then Mr. Jeff Sheets, the guitar at the beginning with Angels We Have Heard on High. And what are we doing for the outro music?
What are we doing? I don't know which one.
I think it's Oh Holy Night.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jeff, what if they want to get in touch with us?
Well, then they should write to us. They should write to you at dave@navseam.com. Don't forget the V.
Or jeff@adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V and ad Navseam.
Yes.
We still continue to get the greatest kinds of letters from our fans, always filled with lots of interesting, excellent questions.
Yeah.
It takes us time to think about them.
It does. Yeah. So
Right.
send us ideas for episode. You want to
Yeah.
shout out, just give us, we'd love to get to know you.
That's right. Pick up a T-shirt, a Quai Nocent Docent. What
that
doesn't
too.
hurt you makes you stronger, at our website where you can lurch with merch.
Yeah.
Jeff, what's on tap for episode 108?
Are we diving back into the Aeneid? I believe we're gonna
Yeah, that seems right.
back into book. Are we getting to book 8?
Book 8.
Fantastic.
That's right.
Yes.
De Libro Octavo.
Yeah.
And you've got the gustatory parting shot tonight. Is that right?
I do. This comes from one Anthelme Brillat Savarin.
Oh, nice. Some
And,
French.
Yes, he writes, the destiny of nations depends upon the manner in which they feed themselves.
So what do you think is in store for America?
Not good.
With hamburgers and hot dogs
Exactly
and
right.
spam and
Diet as destiny. It's not promising.
it's not looking good.
Right.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.